appreciate Williams asking me to do this. What I'm going to be talking about, in case you wonder after I finish, I always like to tell you what I intend to talk about. And then, as so often happens in churches, people go home and say, I really didn't get it. And my word to churches where I've been pastor is, don't call me, call somebody else. You know, I've already given you what I have, and if you didn't get it, that's the best I could do. But I really appreciate your being a part of this, and we're going to be looking at the parables. More specifically, we're going to be looking at the parables in the Gospel of Luke. There are 12 parables that we're going to look at, not obviously tonight, but one parable per night. And what I want to do is to leave some time for you to respond in any way you want to, with any insights into the parable that I'm talking about, or any rebuttals that you have about what I have to say. We're among friends, and so I won't take it personally if you think I have totally missed the point of the parable. I would like to hear from you. The parable tonight, and I don't know whether you got this or not, so let me just read the parable. The parable is found in the 5th chapter of Luke, verses 36 through 39. Jesus also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and sews it on an old garment. Otherwise, the new will be torn, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine in old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins and will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new wine, but says the old is good. What I want to do is to talk a little bit about this parable, and as I do, to weave in some general statements about parables. You and I can find the parables of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what are called the synoptic gospels, synopses of Jesus' life. You can squeeze the Gospel of John all you want, but you will not find a single parable. John operates in a different way. The way John operates is through what are called I am statements. That's the power of John. I am the resurrection of the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the door. This is the way John. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find a number of parables. Particularly in Luke, we find some of the parables with which we are most familiar. Next week, we're going to look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. I would say out of the parables, that probably the two parables that are most familiar to people and are among the favorites that people have are the parable of the Good Samaritan and the parable of what we call the prodigal son. Although when we get to the parable of the prodigal son, I'm going to rename that parable. But those are the two parables found only in the Gospel of Luke, those two parables. They're not found in Matthew, Mark, found only in the Gospel of Luke. And we will get to those parables. when you and I look at parables, particularly the parable that I read just a few minutes ago, we realize that parables are stories that are told by Jesus. They have a literal sense in which Jesus tells them, but more importantly, they have a symbolic sense. So when we approach a parable, what we are trying to do is not to say that this parable literally happened, but rather, what is the symbolic meaning of this parable for you and for me? In other words, we not only stand behind the Bible to read the parable, but also we stand in front of the Bible, in front of the parable, to see what its impact is on our lives. Parables are not just nice stories. Parables are designed to help you and me to change in our lives. They are parables that have challenge to them. And so when you and I read a parable, we're not simply reading a story, but we are reading something that, if we are reading it well, it gets in front of us so that we see how it relates to our own lives. And we say, now this is the way it applies to me. In other words, my own feeling about parables, as well as so much of the Bible, is that there are claims made by the Bible on our lives. The Bible is just not there for you and me to dip in and then come out with some good information. The Bible is designed to make a claim on my life and on your life, to help us to see something that is new and different that we can put into place in our own lives. So we read parables both in the literal sense. We read the story of the wineskins, of the patch on the old garment. But what we are doing is, we're not just looking for the literal words of that particular parable, but also we are looking for, what does this parable say? Why is it in the Bible? And then how can I turn it and see its claim on my life, see how it challenges the way that I'm living or the way that I'm doing life, and then to see not just what is called the informational level, but also what is called the rhetorical level. Rhetorical simply means that when something is read out of Scripture, it's going to have, if it's read in the way that it should be, it is going to have an impact on my life and on your life. So that we call that the rhetorical impact of the story. When we come away from the story, what has changed about our lives? What has changed in our minds? What has changed in our hearts? What has changed in the way that we perceive the way that we may do life? Parables are stories. Stories have enormous power. I remember growing up at a church where I had a wonderful pastor, but he never told stories. Everything was in propositions. Basically, my home church pastor, whom I loved, would begin with something like, my thesis today is this, and then the 3 points out of his thesis. Um, Once in a while, we would have revivals in our church, and we would have these evangelists who came in who told stories that had us sitting 6 inches off our pews. Most of them told stories about what they were before they had been converted to Christ. And they had usually one night in which they gave their testimony. And I mean, these people went to the far country. I thought for a while, once in my beginning stages that I might be an evangelist, but I've never been to the far country where I could come back and, well, I've probably been to the far country, but not in the sense that it's going to make you really pay attention. But I remember paying attention to those stories. I remember when my children were smaller, and I so much miss this, trying to get home in time to tell them a bedtime story. Always, they wanted the same story. The 3 bears. Let's go with the 3 bears. Sometimes I was tired, and I would try to skip a bear. But they knew the stories well enough where I couldn't do that. And what was happening was when I told that story, and another story that I often told them was about the little blue engine that thought he could. What we were trying to do was not just to listen to the stories, but to try to get embedded in our lives. What is the meaning of this story? What is the meaning of a story about the little blue engine who thought he could? And they wanted that story all the time because stories were powerful. They didn't want me to come in to sit by their bed to say, well, let's have a discussion about what it's like to go to sleep at night. They wanted a story. And I think that people today also want in the teaching and the preaching that we do is they want something that is Fred Craddock is, as you know, one of the great teachers of preaching. He used the words, for example, if I say something about the grace of God will sustain you and me, that is a statement. If I tell the story of when I was in Augusta, and by the way, let me say parenthetically, it's always very, very incumbent upon the preacher or teacher not to tell stories that somebody in the congregation knows that I've just been in to see the pastor and I make it into the story the next week. Otherwise, you just rip the confidences of people apart. But I remember when I was in Augusta, and these people are no longer with us, I would go to the hospital, to University Hospital. We had a number of people in the hospital, so I had my office assistant, I had her do the hospitals from the 10th floor down. I would take the elevator to the 10th floor, and then I would go down the back stairs to the 9th floor, the 8th floor, and whatever floors. The 10th floor was the oncology unit. I had a call, a woman diagnosed with end-stage cancer, walked into the room, pulled up the chair, sat beside her. She looked at me and she said, I know that I'm not going to make it. And then to this day, I remember, I can see her face. I probably won't even be able to go to the graduations of my 2 daughters. I won't be able to see these two daughters getting married. Now, what do I say? Well, it's going to be all right. We're going to pray for a miracle. No, what I said was to her, I know this is a very, very difficult time. What I can offer to you is that the church and I, and mostly the God whom I represent, will walk with you through whatever valley that you have to go through. So stories are powerful. I remember that story because it still reminds me of the fact that as pastors, we walk into situations where we so much wish we could reach out and just make everything good again. But the story of our ministries is that we walk into situations, and sometimes we have to say to people, what I can do is to promise to be with you through whatever it is that you have to experience. Now let's go back to the story of the story that we read of first of all, the new piece of garment being attached to the old garment. And the second part of that is putting new wine into old wineskins. Let me just set the stage for a moment. Jesus and his disciples were having a celebration. They were having a party. I know some people who have a very difficult time realizing that Jesus could go to a party. When we moved to Orlando, we met a couple down the street. All they knew about me was that I was a Baptist minister. Now that's pretty dangerous to know about somebody. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, you're the people who can't dance." And I looked at her and I said, well, probably most of us can't do it very, very well, but we still try it. There may be people who still believe that you shouldn't dance. But what she was saying was so interesting. The only thing she knew about Baptist ministers is that we weren't supposed to dance. So through our friendship, we had to unpack the fact that Diane and I, before we ever went into the ministry, were human beings. And even long after I put the ordination certificate on the wall, I was still a human being. And that I really did like to celebrate life. Jesus and his disciples were celebrating. And there were some people there, some followers of the Pharisees, and some followers, interestingly, of John the Baptist. We know that John the Baptist pointed to Jesus as the Messiah, but we also know that John the Baptist was an extraordinarily gifted preacher. And there are some people who identify themselves with, I'm in so-and-so's church. So we can understand why people still were attracted to John and called themselves John's disciples. The Pharisees and some of John's disciples said to Jesus, we fast and we pray. Why is it that you are celebrating life? Well, fasting and praying and almsgiving were the three primary things that marked a very dedicated Jewish person. We are fasting we are praying, but your disciples are celebrating. Now, what did Jesus say in response to that? Did he say, well, there's never a time for fasting or praying? He uses a remarkable image. When the bridegroom is with you, you celebrate the presence of the bridegroom. But there will come a day when the bridegroom, Jesus, will no longer be with the disciples. And in those days, they will fast and they will pray and they will mourn. So Jesus is not saying to them, give up fasting, give up almsgiving, give up praying. He's saying that at this particular time, this is not the time for us to focus on fasting and almsgiving and praying. This is the time to celebrate the presence of Jesus. Now we move into the parable. Parables come in a variety of ways, and this parable is really more of an analogy. There are no characters in this parable, as there will be in next week's parable with the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son. There are simply objects or common things that Jesus takes and uses those to communicate a spiritual meaning in those common things. You don't put a new patch on an old garment because all it will do is to destroy the new thing, the new patch. You don't put new wine into old wineskins because the wineskins will burst. Now that's the literal telling of the story. What is the deeper meaning? Because parables always have a deeper meaning. Jesus is saying, I'm coming in to a form of Judaism that is going to have to change in order to accommodate who I am. Jesus was not repudiating his Jewish background. As far as we know, Jesus died a Jew. But what Jesus was saying is there is breaking into human history such a powerful new thing that the old containers, the old ways of seeing things, can no longer contain that. We have to find different ways of being able to contain this new inbreaking of God in Jesus Christ. Not a repudiation of Judaism, but simply saying the form of Judaism that you are practicing now is not going to be big enough to accommodate the new thing that God wants to do in your faith. So Jesus reaches in to the ordinary commonplace of new patches on old garments, of new wine and old wineskins, and he uses things that people in that day would have known. And Jesus says, but what I want you to do is, I want you now to stand in front of this and see the power of how this is going to change your life. Now, so far, so good, but we run into a problem in verse 39, because there is a change in what Jesus is saying. Let me read verse 39. And no one, after drinking the old wine, desires the new wine, but says the old is good. Now that statement by Jesus to close that parable, or to close what we would call an analogy, that is diametrically opposite from what Jesus has been saying. In other words, the old wine is better. It's a way of Jesus reaching across to this new thing that is happening that can't be contained in old garments and old wineskins, and yet at the same time saying to his Jewish listeners, I want you to understand that the old wine, the wine that you've been used to, is really the wine that tastes better. It's as if so many of Jesus' parables, we start moving along and everything seems to be moving in one direction, and then all of a sudden it's put in reverse. We thought we were talking about new things. We were talking about getting rid of the old and getting new garments and getting new wineskins. But now Jesus says that if you want to drink the wine, actually the old wine tastes better than the new. Now, this is not permission. I mean, you don't need my permission for you to run out and get some old wine because it would taste better. But it is a way at a deeper level of saying there is a new thing that is breaking in that can't be contained by the faith that you have practiced, and we need to understand that something powerfully new is happening in your lives. But is it tethered to the Old Testament? Does it still take into account what the Old Testament had to offer? The answer is yes. Jesus is saying, I want to tell you, even though it sounds diametrically opposite to everything that I've been saying, that the old wine actually tastes better. So we have here Jesus really bridging the gap between the religion of the Old Testament and this new faith that was breaking in, that was going to change things, that could not be contained in the old categories in which we think. But we have to think outside and stand in front of it and say to ourselves, in order to really understand what it means to have the power of Christ in our lives, new garment, new wineskin, but don't take that to mean that we are doing away with the old wine. We are bringing both of these together. And Jesus is going, throughout the Gospel of Luke, is going to be talking about ways in which we are bringing together both his Jewish heritage, the Hebrew Bible, as well as what will become, and not yet written, what but what will become the New Testament or the New Covenant. Now, it's interesting, and I'll close with this. It's interesting that we have 4 Gospels. Have you ever thought, wouldn't it be better if we just had one that was just said it and there wasn't, there wasn't the story of the prodigal son in Luke's Gospel, which is such a powerful story that it doesn't appear anywhere else in any of the Gospels? Wouldn't it be better, for example, if we turn to the 11th chapter of John and we read the story of Lazarus coming out of the grave on the 4th day, still bound in his grave clothes? That is the pivotal moment in the Gospel of John. Search Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you will not find the story of Lazarus. What the New Testament, what the early church opted to do was to say, we want to have 4 vantage points of Jesus. There were some particularly in the 2nd century, like a man by the name of Tatian, who said, let me just pull all these 4 Gospels into one and make them smoother. There was another man, later declared a heretic, by the name of Marcion, who said, what I'm going to do is just take the Gospel of Luke and some of the letters of Paul. I'm going to do away with the Old Testament because the God of the Old Testament doesn't seem like the kind of God that I want to worship. The church, though, in its wisdom said, what we need to do is we need to have these 4 different perspectives of Jesus with different stories saying things that are important to my life and to your life. So standing in front of this, not standing behind it, reading it, not just opening the book, and reading the words that are flat on the page, but allowing those words to become alive so that they become written into the pages of our own lives. They're not just words. In fact, these words weren't written down. The Gospel of Luke was probably not put together until about 85 AD. These stories circulated orally, and then they were put into writing as people moved away from the life of Jesus. But so powerful, particularly if in the living of my days and my nights, I can somehow take these words and move them from being just flat on a page or just words on a notebook or words on a telephone, and they suddenly become the words, not just that I read, but the words that read me and read you. And hopefully in the process, we are challenged and we are changed.